The Iron Game Chalk Talk podcast is brought to you by the following sponsors: EliteForm.com, IgnitionAPG.com, PlayUSA at PLAEUSA.com, and Sorinex Exercise Equipment at Sorinex.com. And now, the Iron Game Chalk Talk podcast. Welcome to Iron Game Chalk Talk with your host, Ron McKeefery.
Every time our athletes walk into this weight room, they're going to be pushed to the max.
Let's go! Everything you got!
On this podcast, hear Coach McKeefery straight talk about training, featuring the top strength and conditioning professionals from around the world. And now, here's your host, Ron McKeefery.
Hey guys, welcome back to Iron Game Chalk Talk. I'm your host, Ron McKeefery, and this is episode number 141. Today I got a good buddy of mine, Chris Frankel, with us. Chris is the head of human performance for TRX. So we go back to, he came in for a workshop basically at the Bengals when I was there, and guy just freaking has a wealth of knowledge. We got into obviously TRX, but more programming and just overall just talking shop, and spent about 8 hours with the guy and was so impressed, and has been a resource ever since. So I know you're going to get a ton out of this episode. Before we do, I want to make sure we recognize our sponsor, Sorinex, for this episode. They announced Sorinex Summer Strong number 9, May 20th to 22nd, down in South Carolina. And I had the opportunity to go last year. Had been wanting to go for many, many years. Finally got an opportunity to do it. And as you've heard me say on the show in the past, it is an experience. It is not a clinic. It is not a conference. It is an experience, and it's definitely one of those experiences that you want to have, especially if you or just love being around, training, talking shop, interacting, watching feats of strength. It's just incredible what Bert and everybody has going on down there, and excited to have Derek Woodsky's going to be there this year. Derek was on the show in the past, and I would imagine he's not the only one that's been on the show that'll be down there. But can't encourage you enough to be setting plans to be there May 20th to 22nd, and I know that you're gonna think every bit as much of it as I do. But also want to make sure everybody knows about my new podcast, Ask Coach Mac. If you go to iTunes, you can subscribe there, or just simply go to askcoachmac.com, and you can listen to the episodes there as well. But at the bottom of the page is basically a widget that allows you to leave a voicemail. It's either on the sidebar there, you can send a voicemail, or at the bottom. And what that allows you to do is ask a question. And I did this because I get so many questions via email and text and Facebook and the whole deal, and just in an effort to mainstream that a little bit and try to answer the question once for everybody, I wanted to create this podcast. Very fortunate Iron Grip came on as a sponsor as well, but excited about where this show can go, and just being able to answer questions. It's about a 5 to 10 minute podcast that right now is weekly, but as it grows, we might get it to where it's a daily show. But just something that you can listen to on your way into work, get a little nugget, just talking a little shop, and trying to put some answers out there, and my take, and by far my expert in all questions, but I'll do my best to kind of give my perspective and share with you some ideas. And so hopefully you guys find that great. Go to iTunes, subscribe to it. And we'll make sure that we're getting those episodes up to you. So I want to make sure we get to Chris's episode here. Know you're really going to enjoy it, and we'll see you on the other side. All right, guys. Hey, welcome back to Iron Game Chalk Talk. Got a buddy of mine on the show today, Chris Frankel. He's the head human performance director, kind of chief everything out there for TRX, and does a fantastic job. And a good buddy. And we got a chance to meet each other. He came out when I was in Cincinnati and spent a whole day. And what impressed me more than anything was how long did we go that day? About 7 hours?
Yeah.
7 hours straight, didn't look at one note, didn't look at one PowerPoint slide, anything, and it was sun up to sundown, constant content, and it just impressed me in a big way, man. And so ever since, it's been a huge resource for me. Appreciate you coming on the show, man.
Oh, my pleasure, Coach. Glad to be here. Been a fan for a while, and been trying to catch up on some of the episodes. And it's good to see some familiar faces on there and some new faces. You're doing a great job here. It's an honor for me to be here.
I appreciate that, man. Well, hey, but I want to get into it a little bit. I want to dive into kind of your journey and what's led you on the road to TRX. So kind of take us back. Kind of how did you get into strength and conditioning in the first place, and then what's been the path to kind of land yourself there with TRX?
Yeah, my journey really started back in 1981. I'm not even sure you were born then.
But 76, brother. 76.
I'm gonna try and make a long story relatively short. One of my best friends growing up, a guy named Robert Mitchell. Neil Mitchell, his dad was Bobby Mitchell, played in the backfield with Jim Brown and played with the Redskins, and he was working with the Redskins organization back then. And so when we both graduated high school, we played football together. He went on and played at Stanford. I went on and played at a D3 school. But every summer we'd come back and he would take me out to Redskin Park and we'd train out there with the Redskins. And at the time it was Dan Riley who was the head strength coach out there. So for some of the old school people, they'll recognize the name. And that was really my first introduction to, something that blew my mind and said, wow, I'm never going to make it to the NFL. On the field, but this might be a way for me to get in there and see what we do there. So I got to, be coached by him a little bit for about 3 years. And then from then on, I think I kind of did something that I've heard you say you did, just started talking to coaches along the way. So from Dan Riley, I spent some time with a guy named Bob Tucano, Olympic lifting coach. Fast forward another decade or two, some time with Mike Boyle. And just some great, high school coaches that people probably never heard of. A guy named Eddie Saw back in D.C., amazing basketball coach, who really kind of formed my approach to, hey, you really got to be structured, but you also have to have enough leeway in there to manage your players as you got that way. From there, went out to L.A. and I got into the fitness industry, personal training a little bit, as well as some strength and conditioning. Ended up going back to school, and for those of you that don't know, I'm the world's longest PhD student, about 20 years in, trying to finish it up this year. So I've really worn a couple of hats, 3 hats over the last, 35 years in the industry. And my favorite one has always been as a coach. My next one has been as a research scientist. I'm still in the lab doing some research, and then as a teacher. And as a coach, the difference between a coach and a teacher is really not that much, except Absolutely. As a coach, you get to spend a lot more quality time with your athletes. And then, professionally, about 10 years ago, I was teaching at the University of New Mexico in the exercise phys department. And I was also teaching at a charter high school where we were using, this is an interesting story, probably for another podcast, we were using physical fitness as an intervention for, what they call at-risk kids. Yeah. And as a dad, all kids are at risk. So we used to kid the kids and say, hey, this isn't your first offense. It's just the first time you got caught. But from there, I got a call to go work on PGA Tour for about 4 years. And the agent of one of my clients on PGA Tour put a TRX in my hand, and we played around with it, really liked it, got in touch with the company. They had an opening for someone who was going to lead their education, which kind of brought me to today. I've been really thankful. TRX has provided this platform where we now do education, but probably the two most rewarding parts of this is you get out there and teach coaches and trainers some of the new stuff in strength and conditioning, but I also get to travel around the world and talk with, great coaches, like yourself, like Chip, like Kelly Starrett, and the conversation always starts off around the straps, but quickly goes to,
no doubt,
let's talk about strength, mobility, conditioning, recovery, technology. So I would say that if I tried to draw a map of how someone would do what I did, it would be a hot mess. So I would say it was just a real love for coaching and learning. And one of my college professors, a guy named Rob Robergs, back in the day, really sparked my interest in the whole science side of it. So that's kind of a roundabout way of how I got to where I am.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, man. And something I want to pull out of there was, you mentioned Bob Tucano, you mentioned Dan Riley. You got kind of two ends of the spectrum there. You got Dan Riley, high intensity. You got Bob Tucano, Olympic lifting. You got Mike Boyle, would probably be, one of the grandfathers of functional training. how did you? I mean, obviously you kind of did it naturally, but there was probably a certain amount of curiosity that kind of said, you know what? There's not just one way to doing things. And I would say, I mean, being 35 years in the business now, you were one of the first to say, you know what? I'm gonna be an outsider and kind of go outside of the philosophy as religion and really pull from each of these disciplines. Where'd that come from, and then kind of why did It seems like it's driven your career the whole way.
Um, I'm gonna be honest. I'd probably say the two things about is one, growing up, I was one of those at-risk kids who always bucked the system and got in trouble. And as soon as someone told me I couldn't do something or you had to do something this way, my knee-jerk reaction was, "Yeah, I don't believe you."
I love it.
And that got me way more trouble than it should have. But it also, I think, kind of served this idea of, is this really the only way? And then the other one, I was listening to your interview with Tim from the Lakers the other day, and
DiFrancesco.
His story was real similar to mine. I was kind of laughing when he said he reached the pinnacle of his Division III basketball career. Same thing. I reached the pinnacle of my Division III football career with not much talent, but just a lot of drive. And I would just try anything to get a little bit better.
Right.
And when I spent time with Dan Riley doing the high intensity stuff, great, got strong. Then I got exposed. It was not too long after that I got exposed to Takano and went through the Olympic lifting. He was my first Olympic lifting coach back in the 80s. And it really was you hit it right on the head, the two opposite ends of the spectrum. There were no platforms in Dan Riley's weight room back in the day with the Redskins.
Right.
And there were no machines around Bob Takano. And I saw his athletes and I saw Dan's athletes. And I said, you know what? There's something else going on here. And let me see what I can do to take from these things. And then I got into the whole school side of it and the science side of it. And you start to realize, hey, it's just about how that body accepts some kind of training stimulus.
That's right.
And then layer on top of that the psychology of it. Then I'm like, okay, I'm off to the races. I'm gonna always be the dumbest person in the room, and whoever I walk into as a coach, their system is working for them. Let me find out about their system that I can pull in and make it actionable. So that's probably my biggest secret is being a bad kid. ADD.
Hey man, I'm with you, brother. I'm with you, and I think that that's that right there. What you said, where it's working for them, I think is the phrase to really pull out of that, and that was the same revelation that I had going from training with Istvan Dvorak to training with Mark Sanovich. Was hey man, it's worked in both places, and so why, and being able to kind of pull from that. And to have my eyes, the lens kind of, open to be able to see that was paramount in the development of my career. And now I think it's a little bit more. I think everybody calls themselves a hybrid or whatever you want to say it, but it wasn't the case, 20 years ago. And it was almost, like I said, it was almost like a religious fervor. I think
it still is.
Yeah, to some degree. Yeah, absolutely. I think in 35 years and going through this, you've probably made, I would imagine, lots of mistakes, that's, I think our mistakes are what makes us ultimately, especially how you learn from them. What was probably one of the biggest mistakes that you made as a strength and conditioning coach, that you learned from, and kind of take us to that story?
I think I've heard a couple of people say this on your show, so I'll add a little bit to it. One is, the thought that you can write the perfect program on paper.
Right.
You read a book, you go do a mentorship, you listen to another coach, and you say, oh, look, Moffat's doing it this way. I'm gonna take a little bit of Moffat. I'm gonna take a little bit of Riley. I'm gonna take a little bit of this, and I'm gonna turn it into my own thing. I think Boyle's the one who says you end up with an expletive soup. You don't really do a great thing of anything.
Right.
In there, I would say that was probably the first one, was trying to do the perfect one that you're pulling from other people, as opposed to trying to develop a system that fits with you, your athletes, your facilities, your constraints. And I'd say definitely, pushing the far side of 55 here, not understanding the idea of preparation and recovery. Just getting under too many heavy bars too many times, ignoring injury pain versus training pain, doing it for myself. And unfortunately, doing it with some athletes and some people back in the day, is trying to find that fine line between pushing them to their limit and then bringing them back, let them recover, and jump back in. And I think that's, if I were to point to one thing that I think has really changed the industry most in the last 10 years, is this concept of looking at recovery as a way to get stronger,
No doubt,
and fitter. Unfortunately for me, it was a painful lesson. And then hopefully for these coaches coming up and the ones out there now, they have a much better appreciation for it.
right? Well, one of the reasons you mentioned that, I've asked this question quite a bit, but I think it's important for coaches, especially the young coaches that are listening, to realize that you don't have all the answers. And Mark Hasanovich, I worked for, had the best line for that. He was like, I'm 25, 30 years into this thing, and I'm just now learning how to ask the right questions, let alone have all the answers. And so, yeah, you're going to make mistakes, and you got to. And the more important thing is that you got to realize you don't know it all. And part of being that entrepreneur, that the part that I was talking about in my book, where you're those three things. Part of the entrepreneur is constantly challenging your ideals and constantly challenging what what your way of thinking. It doesn't mean that you're going to all of a sudden throw your hands up and jump ship completely, but there's something to be said from each. And it kind of takes me into my next question is, we talk quite a bit, you and I, about methods versus systems. We talked, we alluded to it earlier with these philosophies, but you're not. I mean, you're a phenomenal resource for TRX, but you are not a TRX guy. Where that's the only thing you're going to do. It's not like you're never going to touch a barbell. It's a tool. That's using your program, and if used correctly and effectively, it can be a very powerful tool. But talk a little bit about this methods versus systems, and kind of how you can have this kind of holistic approach. Really,
you hit it on the head, and I think some of the older and more experienced coaches like ourselves can appreciate that, and I think that's one thing that when I was teaching and when I go out and lecture now, that's still one of the things I try to push out there is, and I think maybe Verstegen was the first person I heard that really said it really well. It's, hey, our system stays the same. Some of our methods may change within it, and at that time they weren't using TRX, and maybe it didn't fit in there, but I got in there and I did my song and dance like I did for you and Chip out there, and
yeah.
Like, oh, you know what? We got to not look at this thing as the strap as what we're doing, but are we doing some kind of mobility work? Are we doing some kind of core work? Where does that fit into our system? And that's, I'll tell you what, it's a hard thing for coaches to learn, definitely a hard thing for athletes to learn. And now having been in a business, I won't call myself a businessman. I've been a coach and a teacher my whole life. My wife says this is my first real job. Being in business, especially the TRX business, that was kind of a hard, lesson for me to try and get across to the rest of the company. Although they're now taking it in, it's a great tool, but it's not sliced bread for everybody. If I'd walked in, with you and Chip and Friday and everybody else that was there that day and say, hey man, you don't need those machines, you don't need those racks. Here I am to solve your problems with everything on the strap.
Would have been a 30-minute conversation as opposed to 8 hours.
If that long.
Yeah.
It was more like when you work with an athlete. It's like, hey, how are you training? What's your system? What are you trying to roll through? Hey, if you're doing something with mobility or core, this might be a great way to put it in. How are you splitting? Are you, we may come back and talk about Chip a little bit later, but, Chip likes to do kind of a hinge and a push day. And we talked about how those things, fall into those. And business-wise, it makes perfect sense because, we're now hanging up in just about all pro and college sports locker rooms,
right?
Because it fits into their system. And some guys may use it for 5% of their program. Some people may use it for 15% of their program. But we have to know their system before we go in. And we take the straps out of the mix. It comes back to the same things for Olympic lifting. I learned this from Bob Takano, the Olympic lifting guy. He goes, hey, sometimes you don't start with the bar, and sometimes you might not need the bar. You want to get into triple extension, triple flexion. Here's some med ball exercises.
Right.
Here's some jump exercises, and then turn into his term that kind of always turned me on was then you turn it into gymnastics with the barbell. So you're moving your body, and the bar goes along for the ride. As soon as you start worrying too much about, the bar or what's in your hands, you kind of lost the authentic nature of athletic development.
Right.
And I think that's something that just kind of, for me at least, came with age and experience in there. And Now we can go into any room, have no equipment, have a ton of equipment, but have the same systematic approach to training, and then the tools become a way to magnify that. And the more creative you can get with your tools, and the more someone can innovate on tools, I think is where the industry and the profession will continue to grow.
No doubt. Well, that's what I always say. That I'm a principle-based strength coach, not a philosophy-based strength coach. And principles. I mean, you and I can have a conversation about overload and progression, and I can have that same kind of conversation with Louis Simmons or Kelly Starrett or Dave Tate or any of the extremes of any philosophy or implement. And we can have a conversation, and I can get better as a strength coach. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's all I really care about. I want to become better, And if that strengthens my argument for something or strengthens it against it, fantastic, And I try to go into every opportunity that way as a learning opportunity. I think the young coaches listening should listen to that, to take that advice as well. But you've had a chance now to go into, countless organizations, college weight rooms, pro weight rooms, tactical weight rooms, the whole deal. What are some common, and you're not, and let me preface this by saying that you're not going in looking for mistakes, and you're not highlighting anybody, but what are some of the common mistakes that you're seeing across the board, in weight rooms, and what are some current trends that you're seeing as well?
All right, if I didn't know you were my man, I would say you're trying to throw me under the bus here, so I'm going to manage this one. I'm going to manage this one just right. I'll tell you what I think are common mistakes, or at least things that a lot of people aren't optimizing. And I'd say the biggest one is the one you pointed out, is people tend to be, in a camp of, we're going to do it this way because this is the way I learned how to do it. We are going to use Olympic lifting because, I've read or I've heard or I've been taught that Olympic lifting develops power.
Right.
And we get into this, some terminology stuff here. Is their form good? Is their technique good? When I talk about form, I talk about, are you in a neutral spine? Do you have the right shin angle? Some people like more of a vertical shin angle. Some people like more of a positive shin angle. Those aren't going to be, mistakes. But within your form, is your technique how your guys are getting there? Are they ready to do that lift, or are you just pushing that lift on them? My perspective, and you'll be a much better expert in this area than I am. My perspective is, hey, if I'm in a college setting or high school setting, and I got that athlete for maybe 1 year, 3 years, maybe and sometimes 5 years, I can get away with a little bit more, for lack of a better term, slop and technique, because those things that kind of tweak you might not show up for a few more years. But you mentioned, our experience in the tactical space. I get to really go some cool places that we're not allowed to talk about, but right. Get to see some crazy athletes in there. And if I walk in there and I say, hey, I can make your guys bigger, faster, stronger, no one's really that pressed about it. We say, hey, we can walk in and we're going to show you some techniques on or off the straps. They're going to make your guys more durable and more resilient. So in a sports setting, hey, I can keep your best players practicing and training longer and keep them on the field longer. All of a sudden, we get some eyes popping up.
Right.
And we may mention FMS, and some people like it. I'm a fan of FMS. We may mention FMS. Some people hate it. End of the day, we have to talk about how you deciding what exercises you need to pull out
right.
of your program for a particular athlete, or how do you modify for those athlete, as opposed to just going into that cookie cutter, one size fits all. And my school training is as a physiologist, and I've been lucky enough to hang around a lot of like these neuro guys, and guys like Kelly, who actually lives a mile and a half away from me, so we've been hanging out a lot more, and I'm getting schooled by him every day. But this quality of movement that really needs to underlie everything. And if I were to say one thing that was a mistake in the worst situations and not being optimized in a lot of situations, is sometimes pumping the brakes and saying, all right, am I putting this athlete in the right position to do this move? Should I pull this move off the table? Now, sometimes it's not realistic, because you got 12 racks going, you got 4 guys at each rack. But is there something? Should this guy be pulling from the blocks versus the ground? Should this guy? So I think trying to find a way to give the athletes 1 or 2 things to think about as they're sitting in there, and then you as a coach be able to walk by and just give a go, no go. Say, let me modify this along the way. Right. And I get a lot of pushback from coaches when we start to have these conversations. They say, oh, we don't have time for that. And I go, well, let me show you a few things and tell me if you have time to fit these things in. And a lot of times that works there.
Sure, sure. What about where do you see the profession kind of going? I mean, obviously sports science is getting integrated more, maybe some more specialization in terms of you got an Olympic lifting guy and you got a speed guy. Where do you see the field going as a whole?
I think right now we're getting driven, at the pro and college level and in the consumer level as well, and it'll probably trickle down to the high school level. And we're seeing technology drive a lot of interesting decisions here, and I think technology absolutely has its place. As a sports scientist myself, I try and put the brakes on sometimes, and tell people just because you can measure it doesn't make it important. And once you start measuring it, you got to manage it. And so if you have 30, 40, 50 data streams coming in, and I've had these conversations with a couple of NFL teams with all the GPS and heart rate variability and all this stuff, which I think absolutely makes sense. The problem is you're going to have to devote one guy full time to developing that. So I think some of the industry is going in that direction, which I think is a good thing. We're also seeing a backlash against that and saying, I don't have time for that. I got to coach my guys up. At the end of the day, if I can get my guys strong and mobile and fast, almost that other stuff doesn't come into play. If I were to look down the field in 10 years, I think we're going to come back somewhere in the middle, figure out the important things we need to measure that I think are going to really come down to whether we call it athlete readiness and recovery. And there's a guy, I think he just got the gig at the University of Texas, a guy named Chris Morris, who did a dissertation using the omega wave, and his term was called fluid periodization, where it was really looking at individual athlete readiness, and then planning your load volume intensity on that in a team setting. And I think that really has some interesting applications as we move forward. I hope we kind of go back to basics in some ways, pick up heavy stuff, put it back down with good form.
Absolutely.
Integrate some technique stuff. I think the hardest thing as a sports scientist is figuring out what's cool as a sports scientist and what's practical for a coach and the athlete.
Right.
And I heard you and Tim talk about this too. If you can't explain it to your 10-year-old daughter?
Yep.
Can't explain it to your 10-year-old daughter, dude, I don't know. You shouldn't be putting it in the game yet until you can get that figured out.
Right. No, I agree. With you're constantly researching things. Where do you feel? Where's your emphasis right now? Where are you focusing your attention to with the sea of information that's out there? How are you pinning that down? Because I think I think so much of being an effective coach is being able to block out the noise so you can really focus on an area and develop and understand and then implement. Rather than a little bit about a lot and you go out there with a shotgun approach.
Well, I'm like you said, I'm lucky enough to have, my job has allowed me to make a bunch of good colleagues and friends. So part of the, and the other reality is I'm not working with athletes on a day-to-day basis. So I'm not, the advantage is I don't have my head in the weight room every day and I can't look around. The disadvantage is I don't have my weight room in the head, and then my weight room in my head in the weight room every day. So if you talk about things like mobility or movement, I can lean into the work that Greg Cook and Kelly Stroud have done, and you look into any kind of periodization stuff. Depending on your team setting and your sport, there's a bunch of people out there. So right now, my two areas of focus really are on this training load across the board. Primarily for football, but also for basketball, and because the Europeans have done so well in soccer, is how do we take the training loads that you put on your athletes, during practice, whether we're using a GPS or even some kind of just, questionnaire, how much are we loading them up with sprints and endurance and drills?
Right.
How do you then layer that on top of what's going on in the weight room? So how can we start to, manage those two things at the same time? And then from a fitness and somewhat from a tactical standpoint, how do we start to look at the energy expenditure of resistance training? Everybody's all into heart rate and VO2 for endurance work, and now they're trying to apply it to resistance training, and it just doesn't work that well there. So we're actually getting ready to kick off first of a series of studies at the university where we're not only looking at the energy expenditure think calorie expenditure of different kind of circuits, but how does sequencing exercise both affect energy expenditure and strength gains?
Sure.
So how do we take what we're already doing and how do we just tweak a little bit more onto it? I don't need to land on the moon. I don't need to do anything brand new. If I can take and tweak a little bit of what everybody's doing now from a GPP perspective, I feel good about that. There's enough specialists in the technique that it would take me 20 years to learn to get as good as most of that. I think the GPP world for off-season training, for coming back from injury, for what these tactical guys do in a lot of period of time, I think there's a lot of room for a lot of growth there. And then the other place has always been, as an exercise physiologist, we always taught, we need to test somebody, we need to categorize somebody, and then we need to put training on top of it. So how do you really come up with good testing protocols that are relevant to your sport or to your job task? So while those sound a little bit different, it really is a lot of the same things, trying to connect the dots between how we test, how we train, how we perform.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. Well, buddy, we end the show typically with some resources here. Give me the best piece of coaching advice you ever received.
Best piece of coaching advice I received, it was from my good friend and my first coaching mentor, Eddie Saw, who was a basketball coach in D.C., who was took me under his wing, and I got to do some summer league coaching. I'm going to date myself again, with the likes of Dennis Scott, Matumbo, Johnny Dawkins, Sherman Douglas. They used to play the summer leagues down there. And he would coach during the regular season. He would show up every practice with his clipboard, every minute, pushed out exactly what had to be done and how all those things connected. And he told me, look, I want you to remember this forever. Structure is freedom. He goes, a lot of people get caught up in this whole idea that, I'm going to go in, I'm going to wing it off the top of my head, an artist, or because I'm a great coach. He told me, if you walk in with a structure and a plan, you have freedom within that structure and plan to make it go. So
Absolutely.
That's absolutely the best piece of coaching advice I got.
Oh, that's a great one. Definitely. What about give me a book, app, and website recommendation?
Book, app, and website. I'll go to app first. And,
Okay.
At TRX, we're doing some apps now. And I'm an old dude, man. They come in and they say, hey, what's your favorite app? And I said, dude, chicken wings. And they didn't know what I was talking about. They didn't think that was funny. Right now, I'd say probably, I think it's still called Coach's Eye. Just the video, any of the video apps where you can, draw the lines in and look at
angles and
how they're going on there. Yeah.
Book.
I'm going to give you one outside our industry.
Great.
Anybody who's heard me talk in the last 3 years has heard me say that. There's a book called I Learning. Small I, capital L, Learning. A guy named Mark Salisbury used to teach at the University of New Mexico. And it's all about this concept called knowledge management. How do you put the right information in front of the right people at the right time? And he wrote it as a business book, and I read it as a coaching book. How do you talk to your young athletes, your middle-aged athletes, your older athletes? How do you take a young coach or an experienced coach and get that right information? That was hands down the biggest game changer for me in the last 20 years.
Oh, that's awesome. No, absolutely. What about any websites you check out regularly?
Besides yours, I
appreciate that.
I'm still dropping in on MikeBoyleStrengthCoach.com. I still drop in on FunctionalMovement.com. I'm living on TRXTraining.com. So I try to spread it around there quite a bit to make sure we're staying on top of what I think is pretty sharp out there in the industry.
Absolutely. Well, buddy, man, you've been a huge resource to me through the years, and just really appreciate the friendship and how you're going about your business, and really, really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing with everybody today.
Coach, thanks so much. It was a real honor to be here. Anything I can do for you or any of your people, let me know.
Awesome, man.
That's it for this episode of Iron Game Chalk Talk. Thanks to this week's guest as well as our sponsors for bringing this episode to you for free. Make sure to check out McKeefery.com where you can join our mailing list, find the show notes, including all the links and resources mentioned, and information about Coach McKeefery's other products. While you are there, please join Coach McKeefery in the comments section thanking our guest for sharing. If you haven't subscribed to Iron Game Chalk Talk on YouTube or iTunes yet, make sure to do so. Comments, ratings, and reviews are always welcome. Coach McKeefery can be found on Twitter at @RMcKeefery, on Facebook and YouTube at /Ron.McKeefery. That's it for this week. Be sure to check back next week for another great episode of Iron Game Chalk Talk.